Maybe you're sitting at the table after dinner, and someone casually asks what you think about a decision they need to make. Not in a formal way, not even in a serious tone. Just a simple question, almost like it doesn't carry much weight. But it does, because the way they look at you is slightly different now. There's a pause in their voice, a kind of quiet expectation behind the words. And for a second, you don't respond right away, not because you don't have an answer, but because something feels unfamiliar about the situation. You realize they're not just asking, they're relying, and it's strange because you don't remember when that shift happened. There was no clear moment where someone said, "Now it's your turn." No announcement that you had crossed into a different role. It just slowly appeared. Before, decisions seemed to belong to someone else. Someone older, someone more certain, someone who felt like they knew what they were doing. Now, without noticing exactly when, that position has quietly moved toward you. You still feel the same, in many ways. The same thoughts, the same doubts, the same moments of not being sure about anything at all. Nothing inside you suddenly became more prepared. Nothing announced that you were ready to carry more weight. But somehow, life didn't wait for that. It just placed things in your hands anyway. And the moment stretches a little longer than expected. The question is still there, hanging in the air, waiting for your response. Not urgently, not impatiently, just steadily. You give an answer, eventually. Something reasonable, something calm. You say it in a way that sounds more certain than you feel. They nod, and the conversation moves on, but something stays with you, because it wasn't really about that one decision. It wasn't about what was asked or what you said. It was about that quiet shift you felt in the space between words. The realization that people are beginning to look at you differently, that somewhere along the way, you became someone others turned to. And there's no clear instruction manual for that. No moment where everything suddenly makes sense. Just a series of small situations, like this one, where responsibility appears without introduction, where expectations arrive without being spoken out loud, where you find yourself stepping into a role you didn't actively choose, but also didn't resist. Later that night, when things are quieter, the thought returns. Not loudly, just enough to sit in the background. You wonder if this is what adulthood actually feels like. Not a clear transition, not a defined milestone, just a slow accumulation of moments where people begin to trust you with things that matter. And even though nothing about you feels completely ready, the world seems to move forward as if you are. The next time it happens, it feels a little less surprising. Not because you expected it, but because something in you already recognizes the pattern. It might be a phone call in the middle of the day. Nothing urgent, just someone asking what they should do about something small. Something they probably could decide on their own, but instead, they choose to ask you. And again, it's not the question itself that stands out. It's the fact that they thought of you first. At some point, your name became part of their decision-making process. Quietly, without discussion, you were placed into that space where people pause and think, maybe I should check with them. You don't remember agreeing to it, but you don't question it either, because the situations never feel big enough to resist. They come in ordinary forms, choosing between options, asking for an opinion, looking for reassurance. Nothing dramatic, nothing that clearly signals a change. Just everyday moments that begin to carry a little more weight than before, and over time, they start to add up. You notice it in how conversations shift, in how people wait a little longer after asking something, as if your answer matters more than it used to, in how your silence, even for a few seconds, feels like something that needs to be filled. Before, you could stay quiet and let others speak first. Now, quietness feels different. It feels like something people notice. At home, it shows up in even smaller ways. Someone might ask you what time something should happen, or how something should be handled, not because you're the only one who could decide, but because, somehow, our answer feels like the one that will settle things. And you begin to realize that responsibility doesn't always arrive as something heavy all at once. Sometimes it arrives like this, in pieces, in small, ordinary exchanges that repeat just often enough to become part of your life. You still have moments where you don't feel certain, moments where you wish someone else would just decide instead. Moments where the weight of even simple choices feels larger than it should. But those moments stay inside. What people see is something else. They see you answering. They see you responding without hesitation, even when there is hesitation. They see a version of you that seems steady enough to rely on. And maybe that's how the shift continues, not because you suddenly become ready, but because you keep showing up in a way that looks like readiness. Day after day, in ways that don't draw attention to themselves. You start to carry things in the background, not just decisions, but the awareness that your words now affect more than just yourself, that what you say might influence how someone else moves forward. It's not overwhelming, but it's always there, a quiet layer beneath everything. Even during moments that seem unrelated, walking somewhere, sitting alone, doing something routine, you might find yourself thinking about things that aren't only yours anymore. What someone else asked earlier, what you told them, whether it was the right thing to say. There's no clear boundary between your life and the parts of life that now include others depending on you. They begin to overlap, and over time, you stop noticing exactly when one ends and the other begins. It just becomes part of how things are, a kind of quiet adjustment that doesn't interrupt your life, but slowly reshapes how you move through it. At first, you think it's just about being helpful, answering when someone asks, offering a thought when it seems needed, saying something that makes things a little clearer for someone else. It feels simple enough. But over time, you begin to notice something beneath that surface. It's not only about helping, it's about being positioned in a place where your presence carries weight, even when you don't fully feel it yourself. There are moments when you pause after a conversation ends, not because anything went wrong, but because something lingers. A quiet awareness that what you said didn't just pass through the moment and disappear. It stayed with someone. It might shape what they do next, even in small ways. And that realization sits differently than you expected. Not heavy in an obvious way, just steady. You start to become more aware of your words. Not cautious exactly, but more attentive. You notice yourself choosing phrases a little more carefully, letting pauses exist a little longer before responding. Because now your answers don't feel like they belong only to you. They travel. They continue beyond the moment you say them. And sometimes, later on, you revisit them in your own mind. Not out of regret, just out of a quiet need to understand whether you said what needed to be said. There isn't always a clear answer to that. And maybe that's part of what changes. Before, uncertainty felt like something temporary, something that would eventually resolve into clarity. Now, uncertainty stays, not in a way that stops you from moving forward, but in a way that quietly accompanies your decisions. You begin to see that being relied on doesn't remove doubt. It exists alongside it. You can feel unsure and still be the one others turn to. You can hesitate internally while appearing steady from the outside, and that contrast becomes familiar. There are moments when you wish someone would ask you less. Not because you don't care, but because there's a part of you that still wants to exist without that quiet expectation attached. A part of you that wants to be just another person in the room, not the one people look toward when something needs to be decided. But those moments pass quickly, because when the question comes, you still answer. Not out of obligation, not even out of habit, but because something in you understands that this is how your place in the world is changing, gradually, without announcement. You start to recognize that responsibility doesn't always feel like strength. Sometimes it feels like awareness, an awareness that what you do matters a little more now, that your presence carries a kind of quiet influence, even in ordinary situations, and that awareness doesn't ask you to become someone else. It just asks you to remain present in a slightly different way, more attentive, more deliberate, more aware of the space your words occupy. There isn't a moment where everything becomes clear. No point where you suddenly feel fully ready for all of it. But there is a subtle shift, a recognition that this role, this quiet position of being relied on, is not something you stepped into all at once. It's something that formed around you over time. And now that you can see it, even faintly, it becomes harder to ignore. Not because it demands attention, but because it's already there. There are moments when it becomes more visible, not suddenly and not all at once, but clear enough that you can't quite return to how you saw things before. It might be late in the evening, after everything has quieted down. The conversations have ended, the messages have stopped, and the day has already settled into the background. You're sitting somewhere familiar, doing nothing in particular, when a thought appears, not urgently, not even fully formed, just present. You begin to notice how many small things pass through you today. Questions, decisions, expectations. None of them felt heavy at the time. Each one was manageable. Each one seemed like something you could simply respond to and move on from. But now, looking back, you see how they didn't really disappear. They accumulated. Not in a way that overwhelms you, but in a way that quietly stays. And that's when it becomes clearer. Responsibility isn't always about what you carry in obvious ways. It's about what remains with you after everything else has moved on. The thoughts you revisit, the things you replay without realizing it, the small moments where you wonder, briefly, if you handled something the way you should have. There's no one asking you those questions anymore, but you ask them anyway. And not because you doubt yourself constantly, but because something in you has started to care in a different way, a quieter way, a more persistent one. You start to understand that being someone others rely on doesn't only exist in the moments when they come to you. It continues after, in the silence, in the spaces where no one is watching, where no one is asking anything, but where your mind still returns to those interactions, not searching for answers, just staying with them, There's a kind of stillness in that. Not the kind of stillness that feels empty, but the kind that holds something unspoken. You notice how your role isn't defined by big, decisive actions. It's shaped by repetition, by showing up again and again in small ways that seem ordinary from the outside, but gradually form something more solid over time. And maybe that's why it's difficult to point to when it began, because nothing about it was dramatic enough to mark a clear starting point. No single moment where everything changed, just a slow accumulation of being present, of responding, of being someone others feel they can turn to. And over time, that presence becomes something stable, something expected. There are times when you look at others and wonder if they feel the same thing, if they also carry this quiet layer beneath their daily life, if they also move through their days answering questions while holding their own uncertainties quietly inside. You don't ask them, because these things are rarely spoken out loud. They exist in the background of people's lives, just like they do in yours, unseen but steady. And then there are moments when the contrast becomes clearer, when you catch yourself wishing, briefly, for the version of life where decisions didn't rest with you, where responsibility felt like something that belonged to someone else. Not because that life was better, but because it was lighter in a way that's difficult to describe, less layered, less aware. But even that feeling doesn't stay long, because something else has already settled in its place. A quiet understanding that this weight, if it can even be called that, is not separate from you anymore. It's not something you carry occasionally. It's something that has become part of how you exist within your own life. Not as a burden, not as a role you perform, but as a kind of quiet presence that moves with you. And maybe what changes most isn't the responsibility itself. It's how you relate to it. At some point, without noticing exactly when, you stop waiting to feel ready. You stop expecting clarity to arrive before you respond. You begin to move forward even while uncertainty remains. Not confidently, but steadily. And that steadiness doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from continuing anyway, from showing up in those small moments again and again, even when they feel ordinary, especially when they feel ordinary, because that's where most of this exists, not in the big decisions, but in the quiet, repeated ones that slowly shape who you become. And somewhere in those repetitions, something settles. Not a conclusion, not a resolution, just a deeper recognition that this is part of what it means to move forward in life. Not knowing everything, but still being someone others look toward, and still choosing to answer when they do. Later, when the day has fully ended, the house feels different again. Not quieter than usual, just settled. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything from you. You move through small routines without thinking much about them, turning off lights, putting things back where they belong, letting the day close in its own slow way. Nothing stands out, nothing needs to, but somewhere in the background, that familiar awareness remains. Not as a thought you focus on, just something that stays. You might pause for a moment, without meaning to, standing still in a room that's already dim, noticing how everything feels slightly more distant now that the day is over. And in that pause, there's no pressure, no questions waiting, no one asking for anything, just you, in a space that doesn't expect a response. And maybe that's when it becomes easier to notice what has changed. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that feels like a turning point, but in the quiet realization that this version of you, the one people turn to, the one who answers, the one who carries things without speaking about them, has been forming for a while now, slowly, without needing to be named. You don't feel different in a clear way. There's no sharp contrast between who you were and who you are now, just a subtle shift, like something has settled into place without asking for permission. And even here, in this quiet moment, there's no need to fully understand it, no need to define it, because it doesn't feel like something separate from your life. It feels like something that has grown inside it, a quiet layer that moves alongside everything else. There's a kind of stillness in accepting that. Not the kind that resolves anything, just the kind that allows things to exist without needing to be explained. You don't go back through every moment. You don't try to trace when it all began. You just stand there for a moment longer than usual, noticing how the day has ended and how something from it remains, not visibly, but steadily. And then, like most things, the moment passes. You turn off the last light. The room fades into darkness, and tomorrow will arrive the same way it always does, with small conversations, with ordinary questions, with quiet moments where people look toward you again. Nothing about it will feel new, but it won't feel unfamiliar either. Just another part of the rhythm that has slowly become your life. And when it happens, you'll respond. Not because you figured everything out, not because you feel completely ready, but because somewhere along the way you became someone who does.